Less than 2 weeks ago, the TV news was ripe with commemorations of Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, 1941. That day of infamy that happened 60 years ago and thrust our great country into World War II. That war, the most wide-reaching conflict ever experienced on the globe, and the only one in which atomic weapons have ever been used in conflict, had a lasting impact on America, her people, and our very way of life. As the U.S. committed its resources of men, industry, and manufacturing to fight the Axis powers, everyone got involved. There was unity then, all for one and one for all, something we haven't seen for quite some time in this country. When the supply of steel used to build weapons, tanks, planes, and ships ran short halfway through the war, the U.S. Maritime Commission authorized the building of 24 concrete ships, each identical, 360 feet long, 38 feet deep, powered by steam and used primarily for transportation of grain and troop supplies. McCloskey and Company of Tampa, Florida, using wood forms and every type of reinforcing rod they could get their hands on, put these jewels together, taking about 90 days to build a ship, and though they were underpowered, they were useful in our war effort and operated in the Pacific Fleet. At the end of the war, these marvels became surplus, and the government sold two of them, the Hennebeek and the Pasley, to the port of Newport, Oregon, who sunk them in Yaquina Bay in 1948 to be used as the port's loading docks for ocean-going vessels. The port became a beehive of activity in the 1950s and in later days, with a sawmill on top of the Hennebeek and the Pasley serving as a ship loading dock, while Oregon was a world leader in lumber supply and exporting. Newport's timber exports slowly declined. In addition, the SS Pasley began to settle and tip over into Yaquina Bay, becoming less stable the more logs that were loaded over it onto barges with time. Eventually, a major crack separated the engine room and aft part of the ship from the bow, and the vessel leaned over at a 12-degree angle into the harbor. When oil spilled into the bay in the mid-90s, causing an environmental cleanup nightmare, the Pasley was condemned and taken out of service. Over the years, the vessel was filled with rock and sand ballast to keep it from collapsing further. But with each such action, more leakage of oil from broken pipes seeped out out of the ship. The port's terminal became a very quiet place, a place of no hope and minimal commerce, except a partial fishing fleet who used the dilapidated dock in front of the stable Hennebeek for supply and transfer. Marginal but new life came to the terminal when the state provided funding to help renovate the international terminal. The risks of environmentally damaging oil spills from both ships had to be negated first to ignite any hope of recovery for a 21st century port facility. A sheet pile cell was installed around the ever-leaning Pasley to protect the bay from the oils contained inside it. Hatches were reopened after 60 years to gain access to each compartment to clean it up. Plans from the Smithsonian Institute were unearthed to allow stability and ballasting analyses to be performed. Compartments were made watertight once again, as hull holes were repaired and water pumped out. Rock and sediment were removed from each hold on a systematic basis. Oil and containment materials that were contaminated were carefully extracted progressively. Old pipes, pumps, steel supports were demolished one compartment at a time until the entire ship was tested and found to be free of contaminants. Steering gear in compartments were sucked down. Pipe tunnels were accessed and pipes opened to the ocean were plugged. All water was run through an on-site treatment plant to remove the oil. How was this accomplished? With 10 men and 8 machines working together to open hatches, dig their way in, jump machines, exposing and plugging pipes and hull holes, cleaning out fuel oils, cutting boiler steel supports, removing tanks, and getting a clean bill of health, if you will, before moving to the next compartment. Art, Gene, Mike, Tony, Josh, Doug, Al, and Jay-Z worked in unison, handling one surprise at a time. From April through October of 2011, when both ships were declared thoroughly abated, cleaned, and washed, returning them to their original condition. Because the Pasley was leaning over, cracked, and unstable, it was mandated to be totally removed after being remediated as a condition of the terminal renovation. If the cleanup undertaking presented a challenge of unknown conditions and indeterminate scope, the method for demolishing the Pasley was immensely more difficult. How do you do it? How do you resurrect a ship that is cracked and unstable from the bottom of the bay and remove it from the premises without catastrophe? Would it be possible to consider floating the ship again even though it was cracked completely through the hull? Or would the cell have to be dewatered and the ship sequentially torn apart, a dubious and lengthy process? Would it even float? The answer became yes. Why not? It was built to float, but the uncertainty of the cracked hull made it a risky proposition. Preparations were made to raise the Pasley, refloat it for the first time in 60 years, to attempt to dismantle it from a floating position. Tie holes were drilled from the deck of the ship through the hull to allow structural build-out inside sheet pile wall. A concrete backup wall was poured in double quick time to strengthen that bulkhead by Andy and Natt, who also patched holes in the hull to ensure water tightness throughout the ship. Anchors were built on the shore to hold the ship. Interior compartments were resealed. An access bridge was built at the bow. Material was excavated between the ship and the wall. A buoyancy and stability analysis was performed to confirm that positive flotation would occur in spite of the cracked hull. And on September 14th, 2011, the Pasley was refloated. Riding high on the tide, she floated proud, sparkling like new, with the trim toward the bow, and demolition by flotation was underway. The upper sections of the Pasley rapidly came under fire and began to be demolished by breaker and shear. Working from the deck of the ship, the land and the bridge, tidal fluctuations meant the deck moved up and down with the tides in excess of 10 feet differentials twice per day, making access difficult. The deck was peeled off incrementally, limiting reach of equipment. The watertight bulkheads were preserved, and despite some early cracking, the old concrete hull was able to be maintained as a floating unit, now with an open top and no way to get back out on it. The lower sections of the hull were intact, had buoyancy, and kept the entire canoe ship afloat, but drew 16 feet below water and had to be removed in the dry for success. How is that done? An underwater launch ramp was placed in the cell bottom at the bridge end below low tide. A single watertight compartment would be floated over it on high tide and demolished on it at low tide while the remaining portion of the ship floated with the tide, using the buoyancy of its compartments for flotation. Would this work? More importantly, how long would it take? Would it be possible to break an entire 30-foot section of a watertight ship compartment in a single tidal cycle? It seemed unlikely, yet it was possible, and it was done. Between October 10th and 14th of this year, 5 complete sections of the ship's bottom were removed from the water, 1 per night on low tide, shortening the Pasley by 150 feet in 1 week. Ultimately, the Pasley was successfully demolished in just 6 weeks' time, a remarkable feat for the success of the Newport project. How was this accomplished? With 3 men and 7 excavators working in a symphony of coordination, effort, dedication, and attitude in putting on one of the best destruction performances seen in recent memory. 7 tracos mounted with 2 shears, 1 ripper, 2 breakers, and 2 buckets, run by 3 operators, Scott, Dennis, and Kevin, worked in concert, attacking the Pasley, chasing the tides, working tidal hours, pulling the ship ahead at the highs and busting to pull out rubble mounds at the lows of unknown extent, selecting the next tool to use at the right time to demolish the Pasley in 6 weeks' time. Like a surgeon reaching for his knives and scalpels, the tooled-up excavators were trotted into position to manage removal of the current shape that was disappearing underwater, and at just the right time. Each night, a different set of circumstances called for adjusted procedures, and each morning, the Pasley got shorter until it was gone, reduced to piles of rubble and steel. Steel from 1944 that will be used again for a new purpose in 2012. The SS Pasley, born in 1944 in Florida, sailing the Pacific in 1944 and ending the war in Perth, Australia, sunk in Newport in 1948, and abandoned in 1996, but raised in 2011, only to meet the 3 surgeons with their 7 scalpels and the symphony director who presided over that final demise of the Pasley. May she rest in peace.